Let's take another look at Psalm 68 through our 6 interpretive lenses. The first is the lens of the author. How did the author understand this psalm? What is the psalm about? And we observe that it is a psalm of David and a festival song. David probably composed it. My guess is that when the Ark of the Covenant was brought up to Jerusalem, this would have been a perfect time for this song to have been composed. We don't have any specific evidence of that other than this is a festival song, a processional song, and no doubt there was a procession as David danced before the Lord as he brought the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem. So that seems to be a good fit for the occasion for this. We do get a good picture of corporate worship in Israel at this time. Verses 24 through 27 describe that procession, the orderliness of it, of the leadership of it, of music, celebration. This seemed to be a key part as they reenacted their history. They sort of embodied it. They lived out this journey in the form of a procession. It's not something that we do so much in modern worship, but it was certainly part of the way that Israel remembered their story of what God had done through them, with them. In terms of theology, we see God as a protector of the fatherless, the widows, the lonely, the enslaved, the prisoners, the needy. And so we see that God's justice is both restorative and punitive. There's always this two sides to it. There is his restorative justice, his concern for the weakest in society, as well as his punitive judgment, his judgment upon the enemies, the oppressors. And this is a righteous and just judgment that we see. We also see in this psalm, the verses 16, verse 18, that God dwells with his people. He has made their city his home. He's moved in with them. That's a radical thing in the ancient world. The gods lived up in the heavens, and the people were there just to make food for them, serve them. But God is seen as being with his people, dwelling in their midst. So that's a pretty cool thing. Also, in terms of theology, we see again God's restorative justice. He is bearing up our burdens. He is the one in verse 35 that gives power and strength to his people. But likewise, there's also the punitive aspect to his judgment, that he strikes the heads of his enemies, that he will trample underfoot those who are lusting after ill-gotten gain. He scatters the warmongers. And then we also see in verses 33 through 35 God's sovereignty over creation. I mentioned the similarity to Psalm 29, which is a psalm about God's power in the storm, his voices over the waters. We see that echoed here, that God is behind the storm. God is the power that gives us rain, that takes care of watering the earth. And we see that most graphically when we see the power of a storm. It's a picture of God's sovereignty and provision over creation. As we move to the lens of Jesus, I should mention the compiler's note here. This is the fourth of four hymns, Psalm 65 through 68, in Book 2. So it seems that these four hymns were placed together. They're festival songs, similar, and this is kind of the final one, the climactic one. All of these four hymns focus on this theme of God being with us. As far as the lens of Jesus, we should mention Ephesians 4:8. Paul quotes verse 18, although he changes it a bit, and should also note that the early church, not just Ephesians, but the early church traditionally associated this psalm with the ascension of Jesus, that Jesus is in fact the incarnation of this psalm. Jesus leads us from Egypt, that is sin and death, to heaven, that is victory over sin and death, atonement and life. He is the leader. He is the cloud rider, and we are with him on this journey to heaven. So that's the New Testament lens of this, the Jesus lens of this. We take this from Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul says that when he ascended on high, that is Jesus, he took many captives. So he was victorious, just like the conquering king who had captives that he had defeated. But here's the difference. The psalmist said, and he received gifts, but here Paul says he gave gifts. And this is following an Aramaic targum that has a different translation of this. And so he uses that, and he speaks about how Jesus, in fact, gives gifts. So yes, no doubt Jesus receives gifts. He receives our worship. He is worthy of that. But he, unlike ancient kings, also gives gifts. In this case, it is the gift of ministry, of apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, equipping his church with leadership gifts. So that's what we have there. Now we have, this continues, Jesus, I think of Matthew 11, 28, 30, where Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." Jesus is the one who bears us up and bears our burdens. I can't help but think of Genesis 3:15 with verse 21, God will strike the heads of his enemies, where it was prophesied that the seed of woman would crush the head of the serpent, and Jesus being that seed of woman, that descendant that would do that. And then I can't help but think of Jesus too with verse 33. To him who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens, sends out his voice, his mighty voice. This sounds a lot like what Jesus had to say in Matthew 24:30. That speaking of the Son of Man, he said, "There will appear in the heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." So Jesus is the ultimate cloud rider. Revelation 1:7 says, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen. Even so, amen." So Jesus portrayed here very clearly in the psalm as the one who crushed the head of the enemy, who receives the worship of men, who gives gifts, leadership gifts to men, and is coming again in the clouds. And finally, verses 31 and 32 make me think of the church, the global church, and how the church has welcomed people from all nations. Egypt, Cush, the kingdoms of the earth sing to God. This is a missionary moment here in this psalm. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. The early church flourished. In the early centuries, the church grew to encompass all of what was the Roman Empire, as well as North Africa, quite literally Egypt and Cush, until the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. The church dominated these areas and caused a tremendous amount of flourishing and scholarship and blessing to the nations. So that's Psalm 68. I would say, in terms of applying it to our lives personally, I think it's important to remember that all of us, as believers in Jesus, have an Exodus story where God has led us from Egypt to Zion through the power of Christ. And like David, we can tell our story of God, the one who is with us and leading the way, providing, protecting, crushing enemies, and taking us to be with him in his home in heaven.